Welcome, today we're going to install a set of Hope Tech 4 E4 brakes. They're the black and red version and were supplied to go onto his e-bike. In the box is the brakes themselves, fully bled, mounting kit and a spare pair of pads. You could mount these brakes straight onto your bike, ride off, nothing else to do, but in reality the hoses would be too long or you'll have internal cable routing and you'll have to cut them down. These brakes are supplied without a spacer between the pads. Tempting as it is, do not pull the brake lever at this stage until you have either a spacer between the pads or the disc itself. Unfortunately, this is exactly what the customer's done here and popped the pistons out of the caliper body. If you do this, and we've all done it at some stage, drop the pads out and with either a large flat-headed screwdriver or a pad spreader, gently ease the pistons back into the caliper body and put the pads back in, and you'll now have a gap for the disc to rotate in. We'll be replacing a set of Sram guide brakes. As you can see, this bike has internal cable routings going in the head tube, down under the battery and in through the motor housing. It exits the motor housing before entering the chainstay for about 5 cm before popping out just before the brake. It's one of the more torturous cable routings you'll find on a bike, but I'll show you how to do this quickly and easily. These are the tools you'll need: a 5mm Allen wrench to attach the caliper to the frame or forks, a 4mm Allen wrench to attach the brake lever to the handlebar, pliers, cable cutters, 8mm spanner. I also need a torque wrench, but this will be depending on your attachment of your hose to your frame or forks or internal routing. You will also need a pad spreader, internal routing guide if you have internal cables on your frame, and gloves to keep the brake fluid off of your hands. You will also need isopropanol and a cloth. If you've not used an internal cable routing tool before, this is a park version, but they all work in pretty much the same way. Screw the tool into the end of the hose of the brake that you're taking off the bike while it's still on the bike. As you can see, this creates a solid attachment and allows you to pull the hose through the frame. Okay, let's start by removing the old brake. I won't show you much detail here because it'll be specific to the brake that you have on your bike. Be careful when removing the hose. Try not to spill any of the brake fluid. If you do, use some of the isopropanol alcohol to clean it up with. Once it's removed, put the brake in a plastic bag to stop the brake fluid from getting all over your workshop. Now for the fun part, we're ready to install the new brake. Grab your 4mm Allen key or Allen wrench. There's just one bolt on this fixing. Unscrew it and the clamp will hinge open. If you drive on the left hand side of the road like we do in the UK, then your front brake will tend to be on the right hand side. If you drive on the right hand side of the road, then your front brake tends to be on the left, vice versa. This is a mountain bike, so you may never ride on the road, so you can choose whichever side you prefer. Mount the brake horizontal to the ground initially on the handlebar. You just need to tighten the brake up to hold it in position. We'll be moving it to the correct angle later on. Before we cut the front brake hose, we need to mount the caliper onto the fork. Route the hose on the bike following either where the previous brake went or your new desired route. We'll be reusing the customer's 203mm discs and thus also the brake mount adapters. I'm double checking here, offering up the mount adapter to the brake to make sure there's clearance on it. This all looks good, so I'm going ahead and mounting the caliper. The bolts supplied in the box are for 160mm discs. As this is the larger rotor, we're going to reuse the old bolts. These can be swapped over at a later date if needed. Do the 5mm bolts up all the way, then back them off a quarter of a turn. This is to allow for adjustment later. We are now ready to shorten the hose. If you're careful, you won't have to re-bleed the brakes. Grab a cloth with some IPA or rubbing alcohol on. With an 8mm spanner, release the tension off the barrel, then unscrew it the rest of the way with your fingers, being careful to catch any drips. Slide back the silver barrel or shroud to reveal the brass olive and insert. We'll be cutting off the olive and insert and using the new one supplied in the box. Slide off the barrel or shroud, we're going to reuse that. Wipe off any excess brake fluid. Now it's time to cut the brake hose. Remember, you can only do this once. If you cut it wrong, you need a new hose. What I like to do is run the cable to the length and the position you think is correct. Put a very light mark on the hose where you want to cut it with either the cable cutters or with a pen. Place the mark on the brake where you intend to cut it and then move the handlebars either side to the full extension. Don't forget to add a few centimetres just to give you a little bit of tolerance. Now cut the hose, making sure you're cutting square across the actual hose itself. My cutters have a small tool on it which allows you to round the end of the hose. This makes it easier to put the brass insert into the hole. We are now ready to reassemble the hose. Slide the silver shroud over the end of the hose with the open end outwards. The brass olive goes on next. Then you push the brass insert inside the hose. If you haven't got the hose perfectly round, then it can be quite tricky and you can get a special tool to help you out here. Slide the shroud and olive up over so it covers up the insert. Then place the small brass washer on the end of the insert. Be careful, these are very easy to drop. Then finger tighten the hose back onto the brake body. Then do the final bit up with your 6mm spanner. You'll find as you tighten it up right at the end, the hose wants to twist as you're turning it. There are two solutions for this. Either get some hydraulic grease and put it on the olive before you start tightening it up, or tighten the shroud all the way up, then back it off a quarter of a turn, twist the hose with your hand and then tighten it up again. This should leave the hose in the correct position without any twists or bends. You should not pull the brake lever at any point during this process until the hose is back on. We're now almost done. We just need to align the brake caliper on the disc. To do this, the caliper body should be free moving and slightly loose. Pull the brake lever on and hold it in place. Do the 5mm Allen bolts up, still holding the brake lever. Now it's time to see if your hard work has all paid off. Grab the wheel and spin it to see if it's rubbing at all. I've been lucky here and it's perfectly aligned first time. If it's slightly rubbing, either repeat the process again or look down the caliper itself and you should be able to see daylight between the disc and the pad either side. If the disc is over to one side touching one of the pads, undo one of the bolts at a time and visually centre the disc within the caliper. If you're finding this tricky, you can get a special tool. It's two thin pieces of metal that go either side of the disc to give you an equal space in between the pads. Now you need to go around and check all the attachments for the hose on the frame and the forks to make sure they're all tight. Now you need to just angle the brake lever and get it at the desired distance from the grip. I'm using the old rear brake lever on the other side as a template. You might want to do a few rides to find the correct position for you. The rear brake lever removal and installation is exactly the same as the front. So let's fast forward to how to remove and install internal cables in a frame. This is the old rear brake hose. Whatever you do, don't pull it out. We're going to use it to guide the new hose through. I'm just rounding the hose to make it easier to put the guide tool in. The guide tool simply screws into the end of the hose. Give it a tug to make sure it's secure. There's nothing worse than it coming out somewhere deep in the frame. Now pull the hose from the other end, making sure you hold on to the end of the actual tool. You don't want that going into the frame. Once the hose is out the other end of the frame, I always tape the tool to one of the cables so it can't be pulled in. This is the route the rear hose takes through the frame. The new hose is now ready to go back the other way. The hose is still the same length that came out of the box. We can do all the adjustment later. So just screw the tool onto the end and we're ready to start feeding it in. I find the best method here is to pull on the tool one end and gently ease the hose in from the other end. If you hit an obstruction, pull the hose back slightly. Don't try and tug on the actual tool because you'll pull it out the end. Just a quick note here, most entrants to the internal routing have a plastic grommet on. Some of them are attached with a small Allen key bolt, some of them just press fit, but don't forget to put it back on because there's nothing more frustrating than getting all the way through and finding you've left it off. What I like to do next is pull the amount of hose through that you need for slack so the actual rear caliper sits in the right place. You can screw the caliper down at this stage, but I've got quite a tight routing around the motor, so I've left myself a little bit of slack. I'm going to fast forward through this section because it's just rinse and repeat trying to get the hose through the motor housing. And although it may be relevant to some people, it's not particularly relevant to the installation of these brakes. We're now ready to remove the tape that's holding the tool on and pull the hose out of the head tube. As you pull the hose out, make sure it's not caught around anything or there's any slack on the actual hose. It's quite easy on this bike, so I've removed the battery compartment, but if you hold either end of the hose where it comes out of the frame and pull it, you'll be able to see whether it's caught on anything. Just pull it backwards and forwards. Remove the tool from the end of the hose, offer the hose up to the brake lever and then wiggle the handlebars again to make sure you've got enough slack on it. It's always better to go for 1 centimetre or 2 longer because you can always cut it down later if you need to. But you don't want to go crazy because you'll end up getting the hose caught on bushes and trees, etc. It's now time to prepare the end of the hose again, making sure it's round. It's time to put the silver shroud back on, followed by the olive, insert, then washer. Screw the hose back on, initially with your fingers, then with an 8mm spanner. Now if you haven't already, mount the caliper back onto the frame. It's obviously easier to do that without the rear wheel links, it gives you a bit more room, but obviously don't pull the brake lever until you've put the rear wheel back in, and obviously you'll need that anyway to centre the caliper over the disc. I'm not going to walk you through that again because it's exactly the same setup as the front brake. That's the installation pretty much finished. If you do need to bleed the brake, I'll cover that in another video. If I've missed anything off or you've got other tips and tricks, please leave it in the comments below.